Hello everybody and welcome to a very special member webinar today. As always, I'm Michael Linke, General Manager of Membership here at the Australian Institute of Architects, and it's great to have you join me for the first time in 2021 with me. As a continuation of the Institute's national bushfire response and the very recent release of our Acumen Practice Note on this subject, today's member webinar is going to focus on site planning and design for bushfire protection. Since European colonisation, bushfires right across Australia have left a very consistent and destructive record on the built environment and the lives and the communities that inhabit those spaces. And since 1939, there have been no less than 18 significant bushfire events of a magnitude that have warranted state and federal inquiries and royal commissions, all very much in search of knowledge and answers in part on how to create much more resilient communities. So in response to these investigations, advancements in materials, advancements in building designs and those sort of things, construction techniques with improvements in planning systems have very much started to make inroads in the survivability of properties as demonstrated in the most recent fires that we've experienced. So today we're going to look at case studies, we're going to look at methodologies in relation to bushfire attack for siting and landscaping, planning and design, and the issues of active defence and emergency shelters with a particular focus on residential structures today. We have four fantastic panelists for you to enjoy today. So joining me today, first of all, is Jeff Dowd. Jeff is the Principal Bushfire Practitioner with EMBER Bushfire Consulting. And so since 1992, Jeff has worked across a range of fields in the fire service industry, from wildfire and structure firefighting to fire safety engineering, from risk analysis to planning and building approvals. Jeff's got a very strong interest in bushfire protection, and that was generated after profound personal and professional experiences of the Canberra bushfire of 2003. That put him in the path of studying bushfire and in search of better ways of defending his community from that ever-present threat beyond the traditional fire suppression model. In 2013, Jeff then went on his own way and he teamed up with two like-minded firefighters and started EMBER Bushfire Consulting, and they provide bushfire protection and planning services to architects, to builders, to town planners and to homeowners as well. Alongside Jeff today, I'm very pleased to welcome Sarah Lebner. Sarah is the Principal Architect at Lighthouse Architecture and Science in Canberra. Sarah was awarded, if you remember, the National Emerging Architect 2020 Prize by the Australian Institute of Architects, and she recently published a book called 101 Things I Didn't Learn in Architecture School and I Wish I'd Known Before My First Job. Get it if you can, it's a great read. Sarah grew up on a farm in the Upper Murray, and she's always had a very strong interest in design for bushfire-prone areas, and her interest turned to the touchy subject of design for active defence after her local area was very much ravaged during the Black Summer bushfires last year. Alongside Sarah, we are very pleased to welcome Christine Palmer. Christine is an architectural designer at Lighthouse Architecture and Science, also based in Canberra. And in her life before architecture, she was lucky enough to work and live for a while in the Jervis Bay territory, where, surrounded by that beautiful Australian bush, it was part of community life really to pick up the hose and to join the rural fire service. Christine also experienced firsthand the 2003 fires in Canberra and preparing, but thankfully not defending, her family home in a very leafy suburb of Canberra, and then volunteering with a community group helping fire-affected Canberrans restore their gardens. Christine has a really strong interest in bushfire and particularly its effect on the Australian landscape, homes and that sort of thing. And that's grown very much since then. And her architectural work has had the opportunity to work on a number of bushfire-prone residential projects and bushfire rebuild projects. Finally, but not in any way at least, Tom Caddaye joins us. Tom is a registered architect working in the ACT in the New South Wales South Coast area. He runs a residential architecture practice with a very strong focus on regional architecture of coastal New South Wales. Tom's projects are often located in very high bushfire-prone areas and require construction to comply with high bushfire attack levels. And one of Tom's recently completed projects was tested to its limit in the 2020 summer bushfires in Rosedale in New South Wales and survived to tell the tale, which is great. For those of you who are already asking me, the session, yes, it will be recorded and it will be uploaded soon to our dedicated bushfire response page on the Institute's website. I'm going to throw those links into the chat, including direct access to the Acumen note that we've recently released as well. So what I'll do then, let's start with Jeff. That's enough from me. We'll move over to Jeff. If you can give us, Jeff, an overview of bushfire regulation, planning and siting, maybe referencing and drawing from the Acumen article that we've recently released. Over to you, Jeff.
Certainly. Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon. Look, I think the very first thing I can say in terms of siting and planning is, for all too often clients come in at the end of the project, where in reality we really need to see them at the beginning of the project to really understand the constraints that the site has. So often, as I said, it's way too late. It's at the end, and then we have to sort of shoehorn the project in, and it can become very difficult. So we need to have a look at the site, obviously the location, the proximity, not only to vegetation but the slope that might be affecting it, and this will be different, obviously for different parts of Australia. So from the outset, we need to have a look, and so I'm going to unashamedly say that you need to get an accredited consultant from the get-go, and that will help you from the beginning to the finish. And that beginning is obviously to have a really good look at your site, what the constraints are, and what is the best location to build, taking into account, as I said, the vegetation, the slope. But there's also other things in the regulatory process. We're not just looking at fire behaviour, but we're looking at access for fire services. When there's extended egress to the public road system, then there's changes that need to be there. So we're looking at access. The ability to establish an asset protection zone, or an APZ, and the different elements that are there, the outer, the inner, and the defendable space. And there might be also some constraints there, some biodiversity constraints, because obviously establishing an asset protection zone, an area where this vegetation is managed to a degree, may have ecological or biodiversity issues. The ability to manage the landscape, is there slopes that are in, say, that are steep, that are over 18 degrees, 20 degrees. That's going to affect the ability to manage that landscape, and also water supplies. So these are all the things that need to be considered. It's not, as I said, it's not just proximity to unmanaged vegetation. There's a number of factors there. And then from there, then obviously we can take into design based on those factors. The other point I'll make is, because we're very much focusing on design today and construction, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. There's about 6 different pieces, as I said: landscaping, the asset protection zone, access, services, not only water, but gas and electricity, and emergency management's there as well. Less to do with design, but it's still a factor. And then construction at the end of that. So I hope that's a reasonable introduction to sort of the considerations there, Michael.
Thanks very much, Jeff, for that. Let's move to Christine, if that's okay. Christine, over to you.
Everybody, we're just going to, I've got a bit of a slideshow to show you. What I'm going to go through is the part of our note that's about designing for bushfire-prone areas, and that's based on all of the construction requirements under the Australian standard 3959. A couple of things to understand when you're going into designing a house. Well, we'll talk about houses particularly. Is the modes of bushfire attack, and they're all we don't in the note we haven't gone through them in detail because they're detailed in the other note by Nigel Bell, and but it's important to know about EMBER attack, radiant heat, flame contact, convective heat, and winds. EMBER attack is the most common form of a house being attacked, well, burnt down, I guess, and through wind-blown embers that come through. and particularly under the house and inside roof cavities. So the most important thing is designing with simplicity and thinking about your form and your shape of your design. The other thing to understand and get your head around is bushfire attack levels, and what Jeff will do as a bushfire consultant for you, or you can do it yourself in the standard. But we really recommend going. We work with bushfire consultants all the time in establishing what the bow level is for a house. The bows, again, we don't go into it in the note too much, but it is there as a reminder to go and have a look at it and just discover and sort out what your bow is, I guess. The bushfire attack level goes from 12.5 up to flame zone, and that means it's the amount of or the risk of attack basically from a fire. Bow 12.5. The number means the flux, the heat flux that your house can be affected by. Flame zone, obviously, the higher the number, the more heat will affect your house, and flame zone, you're going to be affected by flames, basically, as well as the heat and ember, massive ember attack. Okay. As I said before, shape and form, just keep it simple. You want minimal corners and projections and consistent roof form. As you can see in this photo, there's a whole bunch of corners there and places for rubbish to gather in a fire. The amount of stuff that gets blown in during a fire because of the winds that can be generated can cause this sort of gathering of embers and debris, which will easily catch fire. So again, corners and projections out of roofs, out of walls, keep them minimal, and a roof form that is really simple as well. And if you've got a garage and or sheds attached to the house, they should be under the same roof structure basically, and no different. Otherwise, keep them way away from the house. Now, the main part of the structure, this goes through all the Australian standard construction of buildings in bushfire-prone areas, the construction requirements basically, and that basically roofs, floors, walls, decks, railings and exposed structure, cladding, windows and doors, details, gaps and joints are all the things that the standard covers and gives you a good outline of what's required for each of those elements when designing. The other standard to get your head around or to make sure when you're looking at alternative solutions is the Australian Standard 1538.1, which is the methods for fire tests on building materials, components and structures, which specifically tests for bushfire attack, mainly radiant heat and small flaming sources. A lot of window manufacturers particularly, they've got bow rated windows that are tested through this standard. So I'll just go through each of those elements, starting with roofs. Roofs, you're aiming to reduce the accumulation of flammable debris basically, and also wind-blown embers into the roof cavity. And you just need to, through each of the bow levels, you need to consider eaves, so avoid exposed rafters, boxing them in. Gutters need to be non-combustible and they need to be easy to clean, and with a gutter guard with specific ember and leaf guard products that you can buy and install. Avoid skylights and other roof penetrations like air conditioners, And if you do have skylights, they need to be ember sealed using a non-combustible material. Corrugated steel is probably your best roofing. Tiles will let embers in unless they're really well sealed underneath. And then, pergolas should be uncovered as well. They shouldn't, vines and fiberglass coverings, if you do have them, can be protected by a metal flywire cover if you really need to have them up there. But again, it's another thing that can burn on the outside, which will burn your house down on the outside. Floors, generally there's the rule that if your floor is below 400 mils off the ground, it should be enclosed with a non-combustible material, and above 400, you still, it doesn't need to be enclosed because it's considered, you're able to jump in there and spot for, if you are defending the house, spot for spot fires and things like that. It's easy enough to get in underneath, basically. But again, your floor structure and everything like that needs to be, depending on what bowel rating you've got, non-combustible, and a bunch of, you just need to go through that requirement for each of the bowel zones. Let me just check my notes. Walls and roof structure, generally, your framing is either going to be timber or steel. Both aren't great. If either of them, timber will burn and steel will warp. So it's one or the other, and you don't have any other options really, unless using earth walls or anything like that. Insulation will help prevent ignition within the within the wall cavity, and also in the roof cavity as well. And the shape and cladding and detailing on the outside will protect your walls, and that's what you've got to think about is that cladding on the outside will give you the best protection of the internal walls inside. Cladding, you need to use non-combustible materials like masonry, concrete, earth walls. Steel and aluminium are okay, but they can distort and transfer heat inside. And avoid rough cut timber, because that'll collect all the embers flying around and is susceptible to burning. Joints need to be sealed or overlapped, backed or butt jointed. With decks, railings and exposed structure, you can use fire resistant timbers up to bowel 29. And then bowel 40 and flame zone, they have to be non-combustible. You need to seal all your gaps again, and the posts need to be either non-combustible or fire resistant. Fire resistant timbers are outlined in the standard, and they include things like black butt, spotted gum, red ironbark, and there's a number of other ones there that are considered fire resistant. Windows and doors. That's a really nice photo of Tom's project he's going to talk about soon. Before the fire, it's obviously with windows, they need to be metal or bushfire resistant timber. Again, you can use PVC if they're metal reinforced, and that they've and that's up to bowel 29. For bowel 40, they need to be metal or again tested through the Australian that testing standard that I talked about earlier. So you still can use your PVC and timber, and there are a number of products out there that you can use. And also shutters, which need to be able to be manually let down, as if the power goes out, then you're stuffed. Tom's windows there, they've got shutters on them, and that house was completely closed up during the Rosedale fires. So, okay. Vents and weep holes, joints and other gaps. The photo there shows a vent cover. Those holes can't be any bigger than 2.2 millimeters. And the other photo there shows just a gutter covering mesh, which keeps out the leaves, which can and embers getting in underneath the sheeting there. Joints need to be backed with a breathable sarking or mesh, and doors and windows need to be obviously shielded by either screens or the shutters that I spoke about before. They should also have draft excluders and windows that are conformant with AS 2047 will satisfy the requirement for gap protection as well. Section 3.6 of the Bushfire standard goes into details on that. Window weep holes don't need to be shielded. The other thing we threw in the note was a note about fences and how they can provide some shielding in an urban context. But when you're considering putting fencing up, they should either be solid steel or hardwood. Solid steel is probably preferable, but many houses do survive a fire front very easily, but it's the stuff that's left burning around the fire that will, like fences and bushes too close and trees, and mainly bushes on the ground, that will cause the house to burn down later on, many hours later, because that's still burning and causing problems towards the house. And also you're keeping clear your protection zone around the house. It's really important. As Jeff was saying, it's not just the house, that the way the house is built, it's what's around the house that will make sure that at least help the house survive a bushfire. And the last one I want to talk about, I love this photo that I found of these gas bottles with a fire burning in the background. The firefighters apparently turned up and just didn't know if they were full or empty, or, I think if I was a firefighter turning up to that, I'd be like, I'm walking away from this house. So that's just not great. So when you're considering where water and gas is going in, gas particularly, councils will have their own specifications about where gas bottles should be stored, and you need to check that. But they need to be kept away from the house, particularly in your flame zone of about 40. There'll be specific requirements about that. There's a need to use, I think it's steel or copper piping. With your water, you need to make sure you're using steel or concrete water tanks. Then in the higher sort of BAL ratings, you also need and council requirements, you need a specific firefighting water tank, which is not to be used for anything else. And the other thing with, you can also consider sprinkler systems, which they're not to be relied on, obviously, because they'll need their own diesel pump, and water doesn't last long time when it's being sprayed at that extent you can see in the photos. So, and that's another consideration. I'll hand over to Tom now, I think, and then I'll take some questions later.
So I'm going to talk about a house as a case study for building in bushfire-prone area, and particularly building in flame zone. The house is predominantly a flame zone house, but we did manage to get one elevation reduced to about 40. And that's because it was facing a neighbouring developed site, which was considered to be managed land. So it's a good example, I think, to look at, because not only was it relatively recently completed and built to flame zone, but it was also put to the test in the 2021 Black Summer bushfires, when the fires came through Rosedale and destroyed much of at least North Rosedale. And so it tells quite a good story about how we approach the design and construction for flame zone, but also how it fared in the fires afterwards. So I'll just talk a little bit about the site and the house, and then give a quick run through the construction using some images that were taken throughout the process. Okay, so let me know if these are not moving through, but this was the site that we were presented with. Jeff, in his introduction, spoke about various things you can do to reduce the risk level on your site, moving away from the threat or creating asset protection zones. In this particular situation, we had only a 15-metre wide site, and it had a vacant block on one side, and it had nature reserve, council maintained nature reserve at the bottom of the site. So there was very little we could do to move away from the threat, which was obviously the first thing we tried. From there on, it was clear that we could just deal with the vegetation and threat on our site, but that we were going to be in flame zone. The site was very overgrown, and you can see the neighbouring house peering through there, but we just did what we could to sort of remove as much of the vegetation, but we still wanted it to feel like a forested site. So this was the site once it was prepared as an APZ. The whole site was an inner asset protection zone, which allowed us to keep no more than 15% of canopy cover for the trees. But that actually still allowed us to keep the major trees on the site. And also looking down the site, you can see once we hit the nature reserve at the bottom, that was just unmanaged land in its natural condition. So that was the fire threat, and that also at least made it feel like we were still in a forested area. So there's also been a little bit of a talk from Christine about designing these structures as very enclosed structures, being probably just the easiest way to deal with the construction requirements. So we're always thinking of this being, these were very early sketches, probably the first set, but we're always thinking of it being quite an enclosed form and very simple, but at the same time acknowledging this sort of coastal style of architecture and the almost the sort of beachcomber, beach house, fibro shacks of the area. So the house, when it was completed, sort of held that contained form, and you know, lots of people had things to say in terms of the neighbours about the look of it and how enclosed it was. But I just thought I'd show you this image because it sort of shows that while we do need to be sort of keep it simple, keep it enclosed, we still managed to have a good 2.5 metres high of glazing by about 9.5 metre wide glazed frontage to the northeast to bring in the northern light and the view, obviously. So I think it's our responsibility as architects to work to the Australian standard. That has all the information we need, but then within that, make sure that we're still creating these delightful spaces that we want to be in, and they're not just dark enclosed bunkers. So just moving through, the floor structure for this was just, we were trying to keep it really simple. It's a very modest budget we're working with. And so this was one of the off-the-shelf Spantec flooring systems, which is just light gauge steel floor framing. And it goes up really quickly, very economical and perfect for a very simple house like this one. On top of that, we have Hebel flooring. So this was just 75mm thick Hebel power floor. And that dealt with our non-combustible subfloor for the flame zone requirements, light gauge steel flooring and Hebel planks over the top of that. So very economical stuff so far. This is quite a good sort of detail, just basically showing us a section through what we ended up with our steel subfloor Hebel over the top, and then from then on we're just allowed to do a standard timber frame structure before we have to wrap it up in non-combustible materials. So it's just starting to look like a standard timber framed house. And so far it's a slightly thicker stud, but so far nothing too tricky. And then this is a good image that shows us what the requirements were for flame zone. Got the roof purlins there, but over the top, just like Christine showed in that roof detail before, we've got 15mm ply. It has to go over the roof before you actually put your metal roofing on top. And in this image, you can also see ply on the ceiling, Hebel on the floor, and that's starting to give us our flame zone enclosure. Then just wrapped up as you would normally do. We constructed the wall to be the tested system of the James Hardie boundary wall system, which gave us our fire resistance level that was needed. And then just instead of the standard 6mm cladding that's as part of the boundary wall system, we switched it to a 9mm. This was CSR bare stone, but that's obviously upping the FRL of the wall once we switched to 9mm, and then just attached using the standard absolute standard factory CSR system. Then over the top of the windows, we elected to go for shutters. We were allowed, we were given a concession in this project by the Rural Fire Service. Instead of using flame zone windows or flame zone shutters, we put an argument forward, and they allowed us to use BAL 40 windows with BAL 40 shutters over the top. We tried to do that again recently and we couldn't because their claim is now that there are enough flame zone shutters readily available on the market. But you can see here also us using a detail where we're trying to conceal the shutters up into the soffit above. So they rolled up away and they just slid out of a slot up against the cladding. You can also see in this image the insulation there is part of the James Hardie boundary wall system. So it's the Hardie fire insulation. And in this case, we thickened that wall up to a 140 stud to get the thermal insulation out of the Hardie fire insulation. So you can start to see now, these are the things that are adding cost and complexity in order for us to try and make it sort of seem simple on the outside. And all the pieces just going together. You can see the tracks going on where the roller shutters will run down over the windows, and with the cladding, that is just still the standard CSR system on the metal furring channels, and the sarking behind. For the roller shutters on the other windows, we just accepted face fixing the head boxes, and being quite honest about them. They weren't very big, and in the end, they weren't very obtrusive. That's the image that Christine's already shown you before, but just that effect of trying to make it look like it's a nice wall of glass without having too much bushfire paraphernalia stuck to it. Decking here is fibre cement decking board, and there's a few of those on the market now. And handrails, obviously, just stainless steel. You could also use aluminium. And so that's the house. And then I just thought I'd show some images of what we discovered. So we were down at the coast when the fires moved through on New Year's Eve of 2020. And so this is the very next morning. And the houses along the street had all gone. There was one other house that was built in about 2009 or 2010 that had survived on this street. So it's quite interesting that the two houses that survived were the newer houses. Interestingly, the fire that, or the elevation that was reduced to about 40 in our situation was the side that faced this house. And it actually was subjected to quite a lot of additional heat and flame from the structural fire next door. So it still held up, but it seemed to have more damage than the sides that faced the bush. And you saw before in the images of the way this sat in the undergrowth and the forest, that, you know, to take all of that undergrowth away, this fire was pretty intense. Anything that was plastic on the outside, and we only had things like a few pipes and hoses, downlights in the soffit, they had all sort of started to melt and warp and even drip plastic. But the remaining structure was had some damage, but it still completely kept its integrity as a building skin. So the interior was completely undamaged, but we have had to replace basically the whole outside skin. And then rather than just ending on images like that, I always just like to go back to what it started like, because the images of the burnt down house get shown quite a lot. But I like to sort of try and get people to see what it was and what it will be again. Yeah, so I'll pass over now to Sarah.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom. And hello, everyone who is watching. Lovely joining us. This is an adaptation of a presentation I gave at the Bushfire Building Conference on the tricky topic of designing for active defence. As it was mentioned, I've always been interested in design for bushfire, but unlike a lot of us, personal experience last summer really renewed that interest, and particular an interest in what I perceive as a gap in advice between designing for bushfire-prone areas and community awareness around active defence. And I'll tell you more about this photo as we go through. So I grew up on a farm near Corryong, which is on the border of New South Wales and Victoria. We're actually planning on moving back there next year. And the Green Valley fire started on December 30th, not very far from us. And in the coming days, this is what developed. So we were essentially where the Green Valley fire, the East Orney Creek fire and the Duns Road fires all joined up. And you can see that the worst predicted threat days weren't until the 4th and then again on the 10th. So unlike my husband's family, whose house and farm burnt on the first day of the fire, we had days of preparation and days of making really heavily considered decisions. I have a little boy who was 18 months old at the time. So after a couple of days helping to prepare, I made the decision to evacuate with him while I could. And this was just before we jumped in the car. He was doing one more lap in the tractor with Grandpa, doing a fire break around the house. There was no power, no landline and no mobile service the day that I left. Thank goodness mobile phones came back on before that first threat day, where I sat at home and watched the fire burn through neighbouring property, but thankfully it never quite reached us being where the binoculars are there. So, I mean, I'd always grown up aware that community education around bushfire plans and making the decision to defend and how to do it had increased dramatically in recent years. It's gotten a lot better. And I think the low death toll this summer has been a testament to that. But as a designer, I returned to work and realised there was no design discussion about designing for active defence. So that's where my interest in contributing to this practice note was spiked. And I should say I'd really encourage everyone to get the full practice note, because what we're trying to do today is just summarise bits of it off the top of our head, but it's a much more considered and eloquent document than perhaps what we're saying here. So I fully understand that designing for defence has to be a really delicately handled thing. Jeff has really helped me appreciate that it's not a matter of having a set stance as a homeowner, but a decision that has to be made on assessed on every threat day based on the conditions and your physical and mental capabilities. But I think just like we've learned that that's not enough of a reason to not educate people on how to do it, I don't think it's a good enough reason to not consider it in design. So by studying primarily these three resources, CFA Defending Your Property book, the AS395, standard, and also this book, Essential Bushfire Safety Tips by Joan Webster, we've developed a list of 12 fairly straightforward considerations that could supplement AS3959 from a designer's perspective. So firstly, designated indoor and outdoor storage locations for protective gear, communications equipment and firefighting equipment. You need a lot of stuff to be prepared to defend your home, and you need to access it quickly rather than rummaging through the back of a shed where it's been put as an afterthought. Similarly, survival kits should be located on the leeward side of the house and in a well insulated and sealed location. Mum and Dad ended up without power for 23 days. This is Dad's fairly basic setup, and I imagine with a little bit of planning it would be quite easy to have a protected location for a generator that's very easily connected to the water pump and essential services. And similarly, they had no landline or mobile reception for a good portion of time. Neighbours had satellite internet, and that was at least how I could see what roads were open to leave. But these days, as we're moving more towards mobile only in homes, it's worth just questioning that in a bushfire prone area and having as many options as possible. As designers, when we're having that discussion about taps, how you're going to water the garden, how you're going to wash the car, you can also bring in that consideration of how you're going to access all the areas that you're planning to defend with that hose system. And when a front is actually passing through your building, you need to be sheltering, observing and defending from inside the home. So that means you want somewhere that you can easily fill buckets and easily fit a hose. So bathtubs, big laundry tubs, easily accessible hose fittings inside can all help with that. There was some amusing talkback radio during the fires about people's attempts to block down pipes. And my husband also said it was a bit trickier and more time consuming than he had thought it would be to block Mum and Dad. So there's some really clever products around these days that facilitate that very quick blocking of a downpipe. Air intakes need to be blocked off. So putting AC units somewhere that you can access to do that is a positive. And we do tend to focus on human life in our legislation, but we can keep our clients safe by including consideration for them attempting to keep their pets safe and out of the way to avoid causing a mayhem situation while they're all inside. When you are defending your property as that front is passing through, you're meant to shelter in rooms with 2 or more exits, and that can include a window that you can get out of. And you're meant to be able to observe what's happening on all sides. So this is one of Claire Cousins' clever designs, which was selected for the Bushfire Home Service after the Black Saturday fires. And, rightfully so for thermal reasons, it considered limiting east and west windows. But, that's not so great for active defence and surveillance. And similarly, you need to design to allow movement from one end of the house to another through those rooms with 2 or more exits, and preferably to allow for zoning between areas, preferably with solid hinge doors. And also the ability to move furniture away from windows while maintaining safe access between rooms is worth considering. And if there is a ceiling cavity, it's good to provide access that is sufficient to monitor the whole space. So as homes get bigger, this is quite an important one. Ideally where you can leave a ladder set up that's not in the way, and ideally near that hose connection point so that you could get a hose up there if you need to. So I'm not suggesting that these would become some part of the legislation in bushfire prone areas. I'm simply suggesting that I think this is a good little list for designers to consider and discuss with clients and be viewed on balance with everything else that's going on in the project. And to make sure that people who may choose to defend can be supported to do so effectively as possible by their home. And, it's not just people who are, may face a situation where they choose to stay, but research from the Bushfire Building Conference suggested that there's also a group of people who end up being unable to leave their house. So in some situations, considering these things can actually help them if they end up unexpectedly sheltering and defending in their home. So in other words, AS 3959 has been a huge advancement in the construction of homes, the buildings themselves. And resources like this one, Defending Your Property, have been a huge advancement in consideration of humans and human behaviour. And what I'm suggesting is when we're designing homes, let's consider the overlap and remember that at the end of the day, a house is for humans who will make human decisions. It's really easy to say evacuate and evacuate early, but in farming communities, just asking people to leave their homes, you're asking them to leave their business and their livelihood, often built by generations before them, their country, hundreds of animals in their guardianship, not to mention the wildlife. And the other truth is that when state resources were spread so thin, it was those who made educated and prepared decisions to stay and defend who saved significant pockets of country in our area. The day I left, a community meeting had been called and they were told it was going to be so bad that even the local fire brigade was being evacuated. So mum and dad thought really heavily on that decision. They also had my husband there and his 2 brothers, both of who had done CFA training in high school and worked on the summer crew, and whose own family home they had chosen to evacuate, and it unfortunately burnt days before. So together they all made this highly educated and prepared decision to stay. So I think we should consider designing homes that support people in making these educated decisions. And that's me.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jeff and Christine and Tom as well for that. There's some really confronting images in there, and your personal story as well, Sarah, of choosing whether to evacuate or to stay is quite confronting. We often don't associate some of the sort of more personal stories with the work that we feature here on the Architects channel. So thank you for sharing those stories. We have had a lot of questions come in on the chat, both on a public forum and also to me directly. So what I'd like to do is just get Christine, Jeff, Tom, if you can just kindly unmute. What we'll do is I'm just going to start throwing some questions at you that have come into the audience. And for those of you in the audience, of course, feel free to continue pulling your thoughts together on the chat and we can go through them. I'm just going to start off. There was a question that had come in, and it was just in relation to the needs for biodiversity, and it was in relation to the needs for biodiversity and how we balance them against the need in asset protection zones. Has anybody got any advice? Open it up to the panel. Who wants to take that one?
Look, I can have a crack at that one if you like, Michael. The biodiversity legislation is only fairly recent, and it's become a bit of a competing legislation. So I refer to New South Wales. I'm unsure as to what's happening in the other jurisdictions, but from a biodiversity perspective, as soon as an asset protection zone has been declared and the dimensions have been given, from a biodiversity point of view, even though we're not removing all vegetation, it suggests that that area has been very much disturbed. And that can often hit a trigger point where a biodiversity assessment, BDAR, is required. So it's yet another constraint. I think that because it's only a relatively new piece of legislation and the assessment doesn't take into sometimes a limited impact that the asset protection zone faces on the biodiversity, it is just assumed that it's entirely removed. So it's a consideration, and it has to be, I guess, it has to be sort of delicately managed. But I'm trying to answer the question, pretty much the APZ is going to have that effect. The only, and I guess it's what it's trying to do is that piece of legislation, if you've got an area that's already cleared, then there's a common ground there from a bushfire protection point of view and biodiversity. It's pushing into an area that will be disturbed less. It's away from trees and woodland, which is also good from a bushfire protection point of view. So it might move you further away. So I hope that's kind of answered the question, is that, these things are there, and it's a delicate balance between the two.
Thank you, Jeff. Now this comes to Christine, and you talked about keeping as simple form as possible in terms of the design. And, it was very apparent in Tom's case study that, the property he had designed met energy efficiency requirements, but also considered the environmental considerations for designing in those very bushfire prone areas. Are there any synergies, Tom, in design that can be captured? Generally, a number of people have said to me on the chat that they design either for the salvation of the property, but then the environmental efficiency, the energy efficiency goes by the wayside. What's your thought on that?
Look, I think, as I was saying, the challenge for us is to sort of design with the Australian Standard 3959 in mind. That's telling us everything we need to do for bushfire protection, but then still try and practice great architecture that is like energy efficient, that gives us the delightful spaces that lets in the light. So I think we have to, it's just an extra layer on top, and it shouldn't really compromise the architecture and the energy efficiency. There are obviously some sort of competing things, like Jeff was just pointing out, with the competing interests of biodiversity and asset protection zones. There's also a few competing interests of making a house energy efficient and very fireproof. But I don't think it's one or the other.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Christine, I'm going to pass this question to you. Interesting, a number of people in the comments talked about their surprise to see when you were talking about that timber fascia, when you were covering off roof design for bushfire prone areas. What's your comment related to the surprise that people have shown that you are still designing in very bushfire prone areas a timber roof?
I went back and had a look at that image. It's from the Bradford Insulation bushfire design pamphlet, and I'm a little bit surprised as well, but I guess it depends. It's fairly it would be fairly shielded from attack, I guess, from fire attack, if you were using a timber fascia. I mean, I think that for the ones that we've recently done, we're doing all ColourBond fascias. So it's I'm not sure why that's there. It is an interesting one. I'm going to go look I'm going to go look into it a bit
you've got a bit of homework there, Christine. Let's keep talking about roofing, and I suppose another question that's coming from Adam on the chat. He says, look, is there any possibility of using concrete as a fireproof option in the roof structure?
Well, it's concrete if you are using it. I've never designed using a concrete roof, so I wouldn't know, but it would be an option, I guess, because it's not flammable.
And this is another question, maybe to the wider panel, a question that's come in from Mark, and he talks about sprinkler systems. Are they a viable addition to consider? I mean, looking at the severity of the bushfires, especially in 2020, my thought would probably be no. But do you feel that there's much benefit to be gained from installing a sprinkler system, or is that over complexity of the design? Do you think it really, when you've got a 20-foot gum outside on fire, does it really add any benefit, do you think?
I think we did make comment on sprinklers and bushfire bunkers in the article, and I think Jeff could probably summarise on that more effectively.
Yeah, look, I think from experiences also, a lot of people tend to focus the sprinkler systems on the structure, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but a lot of the systems that I've seen are also actually treating the landscape. And I would see this as probably even more beneficial, because the landscape's going to it's going to suck up the water. So these landscape or area suppression systems should also be considered. But yes, I believe anecdotally from the previous season that where these systems were in play, they had good results. There are obviously complications because, as was mentioned before, water supplies may be limited. When do you trigger them? You could be going for hours. There are high winds, so they don't work like a traditional fire sprinkler system internally, which is there is no wind. So there's a number of factors there. But I've become in favour of these landscape, as I said, it's sort of within the asset protection zone anyway, within the first 20 or 30 metres, and you can get much better effect with that. In terms with the bunkers, they're a new thing that's coming on board. They've got some good systems in play, or good guidance in Victoria, less so in New South Wales, but there is a standard that comes in. These are good for very remote areas where access, which I mentioned earlier, is an issue.
Let's talk about sarking. You talked about the insulation, sealing the sarking or the roof insulation at the fascia. And a couple of questions, one from Robbie and one from Bruce, that both raise concerns about what happens if you've got condensation, you've got moisture trapped in there. How do you stop getting then a mouldy roof space after a period of time when you've got no opportunity for that condensation really to go anywhere?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one because I've been doing a bit more research into that myself. As everyone watching would know, that this really comes down to the whole system that you're using for your roof space and wall space, rather than just how we're treating that edge. So we're sort of researching two different approaches. One for those lower bowel areas where we're sticking to our standard approach, which is to have a fairly airtight internal skin of the house. So we're limiting moisture getting up into that roof space. We then have a unventilated roof space, but we do wrap it in a vapor permeable membrane. And my research, I think exactly as Robbie was alluding to, is what you need to rely on in that situation is that any moisture that is breathing out through that membrane can then drain down between the membrane and the roof cavity, and what happens at that eave edge where we're blocking embers. So I think I popped a link in. We've been chatting to both Bradford and the ProClimber one that I put in. They do have some details for using amber mesh detail rather than the mineral wool, so that you're still breathing out that space but blocking the embers. You can't go that route once you get up into flame zone, for example. So we switch tacts completely and we go to more of a anti-con blanket type roof system, which would then have that complete mineral wool blocking solution, such as the Bradford one, at the eaves, and then we look at ventilating that roof space. So it's a very different approach. So I guess the main thing is to probably think about how your whole system is working, have a chat with the companies that are making the key system elements that you're using, you know, whether that is Bradford or ProClimber, and also talk to the bushfire consultant to get everything working together as it needs to.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Tom, I'm going to go back to you. There are a couple of questions. When you were showcasing that beautiful property you designed in Rosedale, there was a question from Scott, and he said, look, it looks like there was no floor insulation put there, Tom. Was that added in and subsequently then enclosed, or did you not bother with flooring insulation?
Yeah, it's a good question because it came up pretty early on in the piece. So there's two ways of doing it, and there's two ways that I've done it. You can insulate over the top with one of the 25mm Kingspan insulation boards, and they give you about an R1. And then the Hebel Power Floor has a tested system for the Hebel Power Floor with battens and timber flooring, floating flooring over the top. Overall gives you about another R1. So you can get an R2 that way. Or you can try and compensate with other insulation and go through the full modelling route where you may be slightly underdone on your floor insulation, but compensate elsewhere if the modelling allows you to do that. But even if you have just the Hebel flooring with battens and a floating timber floor, you'll get an R1, or it's like about a 0.98 or something out of that. So you just got to find a way to get that extra. There's one under construction at the moment that I have where we've decided to just put additional insulation underneath because we just couldn't get the rest of it working. And I was a bit disappointed that you go to all that trouble of having a fairly non-combustible system there, and then you have to insulate underneath and put fibre cement underneath that. But the advantages there is that you're only putting the fibre cement there to sort of hold your insulation in place and make it look nice. And if the flames are getting in between some gaps there, you've still got a non-combustible floor above it.
Thanks, Tom. And following on, there was that really quite confronting photograph after the fires had moved through and destroyed all that beautiful vegetation. And a question from Vin on the chat wants to know, was your exposed galvanized coating lost in those fires? Did you have to replace that?
Well, the galvanized coating on the steel, I think, is on the steel subfloor. No, that was all fine. And in fact, that was a fairly light gauge flooring system that is the Spantec product. And we were quite impressed with how that held up. So no, the galvanizing wasn't damaged, but the colour bond on the roof was. So we lost the colour on the roof, and the roof sheeting buckled. And I guess that's sort of fairly good evidence for the requirement for the 15mm plywood underneath that's required underneath the roof sheeting, because it means as your roof buckles and lifts away, you've still got something there that's going to hold everything in place for a little while. One thing that I've noted about these fire fronts is that they're not like a structural fire. They're quite intense, but they're very short-lived. So, you know, that light gauge steel flooring system wouldn't last long in a structural fire, I don't think. But in a bushfire, because it's passed in 5 minutes or so, it didn't seem to be enough to cause any damage there. Just while I'm on that, though, another thing that was damaged in the end that we found out was that bare stone cladding. After a very close examination of it, we did end up getting that replaced by the insurer, because we could demonstrate that it did have some evidence of possibly being compromised. It was hard to say what it was. Little hairline cracks, a little bit of cupping as you looked along the wall. So even though it sort of maintained the integrity of the structure and protected everything, it seemed to have some cosmetic damage.
Okay. Interestingly enough, one of the questions that's just come in via text to me is, was there any research done into the temperature within the actual habitable property itself? Obviously, the fires are raging outside. Do you know what sort of temperature it got within the property?
The only measure we have for that was that there were some chocolate biscuits that were in the kitchen and they were fine. So,
okay, really good.
And the person who took those photos was a relative of the owners, and so he went inside, and everywhere outside was still smoky and eerie, but it didn't even smell like smoke. So it seemed as though it would have been okay to be inside. Certainly you would have survived. It just would have been really scary.
Yeah, absolutely. My final question for you, Tom, is just in relation to a question on your view. This is from Matt in the chat, and he says, look, Tom, do you have a view on roller shutters versus a proprietary screen system integrated perhaps with the window assembly for achieving fire protection?
Well, not sure what is meant by proprietary screen system. I know there are flame zone rated windows, but they use the glass and the seals that to achieve the fire protection, and they're very expensive. So a separate shutter seems to be the most economical, and roller shutters seem to be probably the most economical of all the proprietary systems. They're all very expensive. To give you an indication, there's a house that we thought was going to be in flame zone, but we've got it down to a 40. But we did get a quote for the shutters, for flame zone shutters, and we were just going to put those over standard windows. And the shutters themselves were $110,000 for a fairly, modest house. With just a reasonable amount, you'd say your average amount of glazing. So it's all really expensive, and I think roller shutters the cheapest option. Anything else that's out there seems to be just going up in price from that. I'm not aware of any sort of proprietary screening system that can give you a flame zone rating, but there's new products and systems coming out all the time.
Great, thank you, Tom. And probably my final question to you before we end the presentation and I sort of wrap up. This is a question to you all, and an interesting question from Sophie on the chat. She says, look, would gabion walls and green roofs be an effective bushfire solution? Or if so, any thoughts on the main considerations? What are your thoughts on, a vertical garden or a green roof or gabion walls filled with rocks, whatever it might be? What are your thoughts on effective bushfire prevention using those sort of more natural methods, perhaps?
I guess, as Sarah said, price. Depends what your budget is. Yeah,
there's actually quite simple ways to achieve a effective and defensive home. I guess, as we've discussed, the windows and screens are often the one thing that does push price up. But in terms of if you still had the budget to do it, I guess it's a matter of how you manage that garden, keeping it moist perhaps. I don't know, Jeff might have some thoughts. I think what the main thing I have learnt through researching and updating this note has been that a home's only ever as strong as its weakest gap, So the big thing really is thinking about those gaps. You could have a completely non-combustible home, but if there's one little weak point in that wall that's allowing embers and flame to get in and infiltrate into the cavity, that's the weak point. So often people go for these sort of big ideas and big responses, but in some ways it's just about keeping it simple and thinking about the little details.
Great stuff. That is it from the questions from the audience. I do want to say a massive thank you for the evident effort that you've all put in today. So Jeff Dow, Sarah Lebner, Christine Palmer, Tom Caddaye, thanks so much for coming today to join us on this really critical presentation. I will say there's so much more. If you're interested and want to undertake maybe further CPD on this subject to complement the fantastic stuff that you've seen today in this webinar, we do offer here at the Institute a really brilliant 3-part formal CPD series on building back better, which is available on our new learning management system. What I have done is popped that into the chat for you as well. It's covered under our National Bushfire Response. We have a huge amount of resources there, and that new Acumen Note that this fantastic team have pulled together is available for you free of access until the end of May. So you've got plenty of time to get in there and have a look at it. But I just want to say to the 4 of you, thanks so much for a brilliant session. We've really enjoyed it. A lot of people saying thanks, everybody in the chat and stuff like that. It's good to see the effort that you've gone to and the really fantastic insight that you've been able to give from a very personal lived experience too. I think that's been really critically important to really bring it to life. So thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate it. That is it from me today. I'm Michael Linke here at the Institute of Architects. It's been wonderful to have you join me, and thanks for spending the last hour or so with me. Look forward to seeing you again, no doubt, in the coming weeks for another session, no doubt. But until then, do stay safe, and we will see you soon. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.